So, are you used to me entertaining you? Well, I'm done with the little warm-up show at the start. That's it. The circus is over. Goodbye. Hello, my dear and respected viewers. I'm Olga Demchuk, a researcher of the inner world of personality. At the beginning of the video, I accused you of the fact that I tried to start every video with some kind of humorous introduction. And I kind of played that role, but this often happens in our lives. I think each of you can recall moments like that. Think of times when you were playing a role, when you behaved in a certain way, and then felt you were obliged to continue the same way from then on. It's as if we are. It's as if we train another person to expect a certain behavior from us, and then that person becomes our overseer who seems to demand it from us. Indeed, for example, whenever I begin a new video of mine with some kind of light-hearted and humorous introduction, I am actually unconsciously getting you more used to the specific idea that there will be a little bit of a show for you to enjoy today. But if I'm not fully conscious and aware that this is a deliberate decision I have personally made, then that sense of control and personal agency begins to fade away from my grasp. All of that intense pressure I constantly put on myself, I slowly start to transfer it onto you, almost as if you are the very one who is demanding it from me. And this kind of behavior, of course, comes from our childhood. For a child, it is important how adults react to them emotionally. In other words, an adult's emotional response tells the child whether or not they will receive something good. And we try to build our adult lives on the same pattern, but in adulthood, everything is a bit more complicated. So in fact, I begin to look at another person almost as if they were a living mirror held up before me. And I find myself watching closely and intently how this human mirror reflects my own image and identity to me in every interaction. I think you've probably noticed that intense, meticulous gaze you give yourself when you walk past a shop window or look directly at your own reflection. Pay attention to your facial expression in those moments. It's an evaluative look. And this act of evaluating, this control, is something we don't really acknowledge as our own. This is an incredibly unpleasant and difficult aspect, a deeply uncomfortable and unsettling truth about ourselves, where I suddenly become that very controlling, nagging, picky, and perpetually dissatisfied observer who looks at myself with a hypercritical and judgmental eye. And I do this to myself, or someone else does it to me, when in their presence I start to behave in an unnatural way. I think each of you can also recall moments when, for example, you were in a group and felt quite relaxed, and then you find out that one of the people present is your boss's brother. Just imagine a situation like that. And immediately your behavior becomes conditioned. In other words, the control circuit switches on, which forces the person to behave in such a way as to create a certain impression of themselves for that individual. So when we hear people say things like, "Oh, I'm such a good person," or "I'm always bending over backwards, trying to please others. My goodness, I'm so miserable," that's not the whole story. The truth is, through our behavior, we try to influence how others feel about us. In other words, with my actions, I influence the other person and expect a corresponding reaction from them. And in this self-coercion, in this influencing, there is an element of self-sacrifice. That is, I force myself, but I do so willingly. If I am not aware of my unconscious actions, then I will experience this as coercion. But since I do not perceive it as my own, it will be projected outward. That is, I feel the pressure, but I do not realize that I am putting pressure on myself. And sometimes, even visually, I look for someone in the group whom I can assign as an overseer of myself. This often happens in groups when a person feels pressure on themselves but cannot understand that it is something they are imposing on themselves. It compels them to behave in a certain way, often deliberately, in order to evoke specific emotions in others. And they find someone in the group or company whom they supposedly fear, someone whose reactions they check themselves against. In other words, this supervisory circuit over one's behavior, when not internalized, will immediately be projected onto me. And if a person has a rigid compulsion to be a certain way, they can start to develop actual paranoia when it seems like someone is eavesdropping on them or watching them. So this paranoia, this suspiciousness, always centers around the person themselves. In other words, at the center is I, as if I am somehow of special value, someone who is being watched, listened to, and observed. There is special attention, my behavior is of particular interest, and my personal life is especially intriguing to others. So you see, this external control over behavior, if it is not brought into consciousness, can seem to completely destroy cause and effect relationships. And a person trying to piece together what they feel with the picture of the outside world begins to invent various scenarios and explanations for themselves. So whenever we step outside into the world, this inherent sense of control immediately and powerfully intensifies, constantly giving us specific commands on exactly how we should behave. And if we do not understand or take ownership of this control, we may end up being afraid to even go outside. That is, simply going out to be among people, out into society, will be perceived as an attack. We experience this sense of attack, for example, when we speak in public. In other words, my public speaking is connected to conditioning my behavior. That is, I have to control all my facial expressions, my hands, my shoulders, my diction, and the way I structure my thoughts. I compress myself from all sides, and this compression is perceived by me as an attack, as aggression, as violence. And that is why, for many people, public speaking feels like violence against themselves. If you are now wondering how to make it so that it doesn't feel like violence, in general, you need to work on this control circuit to bring it into your awareness. This conditioning control, it is especially noticeable in close relationships. I think each of you can also recall moments when your loved ones felt like prison guards. In other words, it is almost as if you are constantly checking within your own mind to imagine exactly what she might say, or what he would likely say, regarding such specific and unusual behavior in this situation. And this thought of he will say or she will say immediately drives a person into the state of a victim, as if they are in prison, in captivity. And it's as if they cancel themselves out for the sake of another. But in fact, to think about what he will say is really to think about how he will treat me if I do this. That is, when we bring our personal selfish interest to the forefront, at the very least, we step out of the victim mindset. In other words, I am taking care of how my spouse, or perhaps someone else close to me, or even a dear friend will choose to treat me. And then, at the very least, I no longer feel like a helpless victim. And I certainly won't harbor any deep-seated anger or resentment toward that person. Because it's one thing when someone is forcing me to act a certain way, and it's another when I choose this behavior myself because I want a certain attitude toward me. When at the beginning of the video I pretended to be angry with you, I was actually imitating what happens in many families. When I come up with rules for how I should behave because I want a certain attitude toward myself, but I forget that it's actually my own desire for that attitude, and it starts to seem like you are the one forcing me to act this way, I delegate to you the role of supervising and conditioning me. And then inevitably I will feel anger, because it seems as if you are making me erase myself, even though in reality it was my own decision. And, it's very painful for people when they try to elicit a certain attitude toward themselves. The other person rejects this sacrifice. It's like if when I started making those playful, mock repressive videos, I received feedback saying, "You're just clowning around, speak seriously." And that would be, well, not for me, because I understand that if someone writes that, it's because they themselves are not allowed to be funny. But for someone else, it could become hurtful, wounding, because the person is, in a way, sacrificing themselves, especially if this playfulness feels unnatural to them. And then they're told, well, you sacrificed yourself, but I don't need your sacrifice. It's like if you went to a hair salon and your hairdresser started telling you an interesting story about their clients, trying to win your favor, to get you to feel some kind of connection to them. And you might have said to them, "I'm so tired right now and I don't want to have these difficult conversations." And saying that would deeply hurt the other person, especially if they were vulnerable, convinced that they're entertaining you, that they're sacrificing themselves, that they're making a sacrifice for your sake. All those stories about self-sacrifice, that I'm behaving this way for you, that I've sacrificed myself, that I wanted to be good. This creates not only tension, hatred, and outbursts of aggression, just like I demonstrated at the beginning of the video, but it also creates a sense of grandeur. In other words, the person in this role of the victim doesn't actually seem good to themselves, even though to some extent they're trying to manipulate and elicit a certain response toward themselves. So as you can see, we end up with a reality that's been twisted many times, and then it's hard to even trace back where it all began. And when relationships are long-term, we start playing these games pretending to be someone we're not in order to get a certain attitude toward ourselves. For some individuals, this unfortunate situation goes so far, it persists for many long years or even several decades, that it eventually leads to a state of open hostility where each person in the relationship feels exactly like a restrictive jailer. And each one feels that they are the one sacrificing themselves, that they are the one enduring. That is why we truly need a deeper understanding of our inner world. You see, when I realize that I am the one doing this to myself, rather than others forcing me into these roles, then, first of all, I have the right to choose whether to do it or not. But to be honest, I actually enjoy these humorous skits myself, because of course I get nervous, and anyone who has ever tried to film videos knows how hard it is to look presentable, to speak, to remember your lines, and so on. And in a way, it helps me relax, so everything is fine here. But if I were to take on the role of a victim, I would make the viewer out to be my tyrant, my jailer, supposedly forcing me and expecting something from me just because a compliment was written. Yes, these skits are interesting, thank you for them. And this compliment would become a reason for me to start canceling myself, to do it for praise, and at the same time to appoint the viewer as someone who is waiting for it and even demanding it from me. But when I realize that I am the one doing this to myself, it means I can stop it. I have a choice. I am no longer a victim, and I can't earn my own sanctity by sacrificing myself. Because people who invent such supervising objects for themselves end up burning out. Because the constant feeling that I am sacrificing myself, when will I start living for myself? That's the kind of video we have today. Let me remind some of you and inform others that there are 2 books I have written that are available for purchase. The first book is called The False Real Self. It was published 3 years ago, and this year the book Locked from Within was released. All the books are available in Ukrainian and Russian, and the first book is even available in English, though only in electronic format. There will be a link to the books below this video. So, if anyone is interested in exploring my work, here it is. The books will give you that opportunity. And now, I will say goodbye to you and see you again on air.